I'm the founder of Amalgam. We call it an amalgam because it's an amalgamation or a combination of a DEX and a lending protocol. So
Mhm.
imagine Uniswap and Aave had a baby. That's what we're building.
Hell yeah.
My background, I studied math in college. I got into trading crypto back in 2015. Bought my first Bitcoin at 300 and later bought some more at 250 when it price went down. And actually taught myself to code writing like a market making strategy on the GDAX API, which is Coinbase's like trading venue back way in the day. And then got into DeFi really hardcore during DeFi summer. Was exploring different ways of putting DEXs and lending protocols together in the sense of like borrowing assets, say on a lending protocol, and then using them to supply them to a market making strategy on Uniswap, right? Figuring
Mhm.
doing these different combinations of putting these things together, and that was really like a fertile environment for me to think about like what were the limitations, how could these things be better, and that and some research that Tarun was doing at the time about DEXs and lending protocols that was really Tarun's partner at Robot Ventures as well as his analytics firm Gauntlet. But I actually came to know about him through the Zero Knowledge podcast, which is just like a really fun, obscure tech. Maybe it's not obscure. I shouldn't say that. Maybe a lot of people know about it, but it's more of a technical podcast. I had been
Mhm.
listening to a lot during DeFi summer, and yeah, all those things kind of came together to inspire me to think more about this problem and eventually lead me to start Amalgam.
Hell yeah. And so this all led you to think, what if Uniswap and Aave had a baby?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the quick like
Mhm.
the elevator pitch where you try to like say as much as possible. So then people are either like, so it's always fun because it's a good filtration system.
Mhm.
Because sometimes people are like, "What's Uniswap?" And you're like, "This conversation is over. Like, I don't have, I don't know where to go here.
Yeah.
I need to really back up."
Well, while you're saying how does that work, you described it as Uniswap and Aave having a baby. But I've also heard other things like it works really well even in like downturns and that kind of stuff. So it's I guess just like in a nutshell, like lay out what makes the system different and how it benefits users to use over like a traditional AMM.
And so to like really try to dive right into the unique value proposition is we don't use oracles or depending on how you want to define it, you could also think of it as like we built our own oracle into the system, right?
Mhm.
And so it's completely independent or um, free of needing external requirements such as and the asset trading on Binance or some other centralized exchange, the Oracle provider providing that data on chain, right? Like we can support any asset. I think at first it was like, well, you can short meme coins, right? Like that's like one interesting use case. But also I think that we've had a lot of interest from places that we were like not anticipating. Like recently we were talking to a provider of a vault provider that does sort of like on-chain um, basically on-chain hedge fund that does interesting strategies that I don't quite know the details of, and they don't really matter. But they borrow a lot on Aave, and they were basically like, we would pay twice as much to not need to use Aave and be able to borrow against our vault tokens. And so with Amalgam, we can create a pair with their vault token and the underlying asset that they want to borrow against their vault token, and then that allows them to access that borrow for significantly less collateral requirements, right? Because they're actually borrowing against the AUM in their vault, right? And
Mhm.
so that becomes like a very powerful tool to them to be able to leverage their strategy and access borrowing without needing to provide the collateral on Aave that then is wasted and they can't use in their actual strategy.
That sounds really complicated. I'm trying to wrap my mind around how you're borrowing against the asset under management with the vault token, right? So as opposed to like the abstracted value, you're borrowing against like the real value.
Yeah.
Could you like explain a little bit more about how your Oracle works if it's not tapping into outside data?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to more go into the sort of why of it, but the how of it is it's a really complicated problem, and we've been building for a long time. And just to kind of maybe give you two like quips that have
Mhm.
happened recently with security auditors. We had a formal verification auditor that's working on some of the most complicated code and verifying it, and he said he's never seen this much math in DeFi. Um, and then we had a manual auditor that we just wrapped up with this week, and he said that the same thing. He's never seen anything like this in DeFi. So we're solving a problem that's very hard to solve. And you know, I was we had this poker event recently. I was talking to, there's somebody from Chain Security, this sort of critical engineer type, which everyone has their place in this world. I don't really want to shit on him by any means, but he was like, "Oh, you can't do this. Just use an Oracle. Like you can't." And it's like, I think it's very easy for people to say like all the reasons why this won't work, and it's hard to imagine that we actually went through and systematically thought about all the problems, and this is what came out of that, right?
Mhm.
So a lot of the problems and why you can't use a DEX to value assets is very simply, it's very easy to manipulate, right?
Mhm.
And so I think the really powerful thing of what we built is we really looked at all these problems. We're like, how would you make it harder to manipulate, right? And out of that came this very powerful fee structure for the AMM that I think in itself is a powerful feature without even the rest of the protocol, because we scale the fee in a way, like if you think about Uniswap, like your fee gets bigger as the swap gets bigger, and that growth is linear because it's just a percentage, right? So the bigger the swap, the bigger the fee, and it's linear growth. And so we actually created a fee structure that we call quadratic, because it doesn't just grow linearly, it grows quadratically.
Mhm.
And that makes the DEX much harder to manipulate. And it also creates a really interesting use case where when there's a SEX DEX ARB, we're able to extract more value for our LPs because of that fee structure.
Mhm.
And then that's just kind of like one example, but we really had to think about liquidation risk and how do we manage this liquidation risk if, for example, like I mentioned earlier this vault token, right? The actual mechanics there of this vault token that's managing an on-chain hedge fund is we just take that. It is an ERC20 token, and we pair it with the underlying asset into a pool similar to what you would do on Uniswap, and then people can swap in and out of that exposure. But also now we have the ability for somebody to post that vault token as collateral and then to borrow the other asset against it, right? But with that setup, we have to be considerate of, well, what happens if the vault token loses value, right? Or
Mhm.
they fat finger a trade, or they, it's a rug, right? And I'm not saying it is, but if it were, then the price changes very drastically, right? And
Mhm.
that's the situation in which you're going to have a bunch of liquidations. And these are things that are actually problematic for every lending protocol, like Aave and Compound, right? If the price moves very fast, you will have problems. Like,
Yeah.
um, but in our setup, we want to make sure that we have enough liquidity in the pair to support the liquidations as they occur. And that's actually a really hard problem to solve. It's sort of the way I describe it from a technical perspective to give you like context of like something that maybe you're familiar with. It's like building Uniswap v3 upside down. In this sense, Uniswap v3 says, here's the liquidity. Tell me what it will, how much of a swap I can fill between here and there. Like I want to, put this much in. How much should I take out? But it's bounded by these ranges, right? Each range is different. Whereas the answer we're trying to get, the question we're trying to answer is, where would this liquidation happen given the liquidity? Because when you have a liquidation, there's usually an implied swap because the liquidator, borrows one asset, uses that borrowed asset to repay the loan, and then takes the collateral in the other asset. And then they're going to swap from the collateral back to the borrowed asset. That swap doesn't necessarily need to happen in our liquidity. But if our liquidity is the only liquidity in the case of maybe this vault in the underlying asset, then we need to make sure that that liquidity is deep enough to support that liquidation.
Dude, this is crazy stuff, dude. You were right. It gets deep. You know what I always heard about, you graduated with a pure math degree, right? Mathematics. I always heard pure mathematicians are like fucking wizards, dude. Like they're like thinking about like equations and shit that people are not even real. But this is fascinating. It's really interesting. So what this means, this opens up a lot of doors, like you're saying, like these like the receipt tokens, the vault tokens paired with like the underlying liquidity or with the underlying assets. I saw an article, I think this was like on the Sonic Eco page. It was like they retweeted your guys' article talking about the like impermanent loss. You guys been talking a lot about impermanent loss lately and how your system kind of manages that. Like this is like directly impacting most users that you're probably going to see through like the Sonic network and stuff. Could you like expand a little bit on it? I saw it's like there's like a liquidity layer. You guys are kind of managing it a little bit differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe to like level set, I have a belief. I think there's some protocols trying to create some things right now that I don't believe are possible. But let me just state that belief. Like you can't get rid of impermanent loss. The actual reason you're getting the swap returns that you are that can be higher than say the returns for lending is because of the risk that you're taking by market making. And in traditional finance, they have another name for this. And like this is like a known thing that I think that there's often magical thinking that happens in DeFi where people are like, I've solved impermanent loss because of this. And usually this is bullshit, or it's like, so some examples, we've seen people try to cover the loss by issuing tokens, right? So you take token incentives and you say, hey, we're gonna cover these losses with token incentives. The problem with V2 is it's unbounded, right? Like it can go like there's no bottom, right? Like the impermanent loss can go forever, right? And so at a certain point, these token incentives, people are like, never mind, we're not going to cover it anymore. You know what I'm saying? Because they're like, you can't print infinite tokens. The other idea is like that you can create some mechanism design or have the right like configuration, or you can hedge it, right? I did a really interesting hackathon project sort of before we started Amalgam officially, and one of our lead engineers, that's how I met him. But we basically used this product a little bit back in the day. Now is sort of DeFi history called Squeeth that was created by Open, and Squeeth had the payout of ETH squared, so that's why it's called Squeeth. And so it has convexity, and impermanent loss has concavity, and you can use the convexity to hedge the concavity, similar to like maybe buying options. And like when we did this, so this is the other categories, like you're going to hedge the impermanent loss, right? If you hedge the impermanent loss and markets are efficient, which they aren't always, but if markets are perfectly efficient, that hedge should eat your entire payout. So the benefit of the market making will be completely balanced with the cost of the hedge in an efficient market. And so that's the other like sort of downside is like you're like, oh, I fixed it, I just hedged it, but then you've lost all the benefit. So I think the intuition here that like I always try to like convey to people is you're being paid for the risk.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that I think we look at this is that if you can pay people more for the risk, right, then there's this equilibrium where like potentially that risk is not as expensive as the benefit, right? And so our structure is that we lend out the assets in the market making position so that users get lending fees and swap fees automatically. Beauty of Uniswap V2 is that it gave a larger audience access to this payoff that like in a order book would be very hard to do well, right, without having a high level of sophistication. So we want to package this value proposition to a larger audience and say, hey, Uniswap V2 like opened the door and we're going to make it even more profitable and you can just set it and forget it. Because I think that's still the larger audience in DeFi at the moment. And that as soon as you require some level of sophistication, you're like talking to a niche of a population.
You can, you do have people that like will deposit LP, and if the APR is good enough, they'll just stick with that. But I have found that as well. I mean, even myself being like pretty seasoned in DeFi, I'll talk to these people that are just like, pro LPers, and they list to you the 3 or 4 steps. It's like I'm putting this here and I'm borrowing here, and then I'm opening a position here on Hyperliquid to, delta neutral or hedge or whatever. And even for myself, it's just like, find myself just kind of sitting there like, nah, I'm just going to put some LP in and get my rewards and do whatever. So yeah, I think like if you can make this system where it's like you're getting like max upside with the benefits of, just being your basic degen ape. Yeah, I don't see how people could resist that.
Yeah, and I think that's always been part of our thesis. Like I look at what V3 did as very powerful to a very small audience, but their marketing power made it seem like it presented it as something that's useful to everyone. And I think that actually was a very negative to a large group of what is DeFi, because people didn't understand that they're getting elevated yield for elevated risk, right?
Yeah, and that's the same thing, I see as well as other people I know that have been around for years. They understand V3, but just the process of like, oh, I have to like constantly check my position and I might have to rebalance. And if I accidentally don't rebalance within like a pretty short amount of time, I'm actually kind of screwed. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very true. It's like, it was put out as like this, oh, like you're getting so much, more value out of it and this and that. But the reality is, there's a lot of risk to it. Definitely, in my opinion, probably more risk than doing a V2 LP. If you don't know what you're doing,
100%. And if you look at the numbers, I haven't looked at them recently, but there's a surprising amount of liquidity still in V2. Like compare, like we have V2, we have V3, we have V4, like we're on V4, and yet I think, I could be off by 5 or 10%, but I think a third of the liquidity is in Uniswap V2.
Yeah,
and maybe some of that's forgotten. Somebody, poked hole in this series. The VC tried to poke hole in the series. Like, well, how much of that's forgotten liquidity, right? Whatever. Maybe, yeah, perhaps. But I think there's still a large audience that is drawn to the value proposition of like set it and forget it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so
for sure.
Amalgam is really just sort of like rewinding the roadmap of Uniswap back to V2 and saying what would be a different approach to take besides going the V3 route.
As like crypto has kind of evolved and become more sophisticated. I think one of the original tenets of it, or one of the things that was most appealing about it, was how accessible it could theoretically be for everybody. Like, hey, dude, you mow lawns for a living? Just chuck your cash into an LP and you can earn some money or whatever. That guy's, it's kind of ridiculous to expect someone who has like a whole other job to learn the full on career of professionally market making in order to balance their risks. That's kind of interesting. So your system is is V2 kind of like upgraded, more like Uniswap V2, like honed and perfected. If the risk is like, if what I'm getting is like risk is kind of like the ironclad law of this, where is the risk being transferred then? If we're
well, it's sort of similar to V2 risk, except for V2 you're not earning lending yields, right? So we're able to say, oh, well, if this is the V2 risk, we have the same risk, right? But in V2 risk, you make swap fees, and in Amalgam, you make swap fees and lending fees on all deposits, right? Automatically, no brain damage, no configuration, right? And so if we can offer more yield for the same risk, that should just be on face value better, right? Now, we also, I should say that like we don't have a concept of concentrated liquidity, but like before concentrated liquidity was like sort of marketed by Uniswap, there was a older concept in DeFi called leverage liquidity, where you say borrow, A and B token against your market making position and then make a bigger market making position. So you sort of loop it, right? So you may only have your actual principal is like 10% of your market making position because you're borrowing up to 90% or something like that. I don't like the products that did this were like Gearbox, Aave AMM allowed this, Alpha Mera, right? These are all examples of like allowing you to borrow against your market making position, and it gave you the ability to earn maybe we should start with a lower number of like 3 to 5x more swap fees. But it also meant that your impermanent loss was also accelerated. And so V3, if you actually look at the curve of V3 positions in range, it is the exact same thing as a leveraged market making position. So I think the thing that is sort of lost is it's really like, think about just hyperliquid, right? It allows you to go 5, 10x on ETH. And we can see why sometimes that's problematic and people get blown up. Well, Uniswap is just giving people leveraged exposure to market making, right? And this is why people are getting blown up. And I think that's the part where like the marketing sort of exceeded the sort of understanding that I think would have been appropriate of like, hey, just so you know, like this is actually just Uniswap V2 with like leverage, right?
Yeah.
So backing up to the whole, like if V2 with lending fees is better than just V2 without lending fees, we also allow you to borrow against your market making position. So instead of using concentrated liquidity, fuck that. Let's just give people that same access, but through leverage. So we don't need to support the complexity of V3. Now, I'm not saying we have all sorts of other complexities, so it's not necessarily there's trade-offs here, and there's some things are better and some things are worse. But then we still have the power of giving people that leverage. But if we agree that the base unit is better because you have lending and swap fees, then leveraging that, you should be able to get more value because even your leverage position is better because the base unit was better.
It's almost like the complexity of the interaction adds additional risk on top of just the systemic risk of the product. And you guys are removing that kind of complexity risk from the user interface. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think it's the point I'm trying to really make is that there are many situations in which leverage liquidity or leverage market making on our protocol will be more lucrative from fees than concentrated liquidity.
I see.
Right. There is a point at which those benefits degrade because you're borrowing and your borrowing cost starts to add up eventually. But yeah, so this is like the lucrative part is really what I'm trying to convey.
Lucrative. We like that, dude. We like that, especially these trying times.
One thing I'll say really quick about this impermanent loss thing. A, you shouldn't be market making tokens that you don't think are gonna, sort of revert to the mean or have some like value long term, right? And like that's a risk of new tokens. Like they could go up by 200%, or they could go down by 80%, right? As we've seen over and over again with these tokens. But if you have a idea that something's going to sort of be in some bounded range for long periods of time, that's like a really good, like right now, I think everything's going to be sideways for a while, right? You're not going to see explosive growth. And, I think we're probably not going to see like another 80% drop in the market. That's kind of like good market and not financial advice. So that's good market making territory where you can sort of create value off this sort of sideways trading action. The way I look at market making is a race, right? And the race is, are your fees growing faster, or are your divergent loss, your impermanent loss growing faster? And over a long enough time frame, the divergent loss becomes somewhat bounded. Like it's like things can't go to zero forever and they can't go to infinity forever, right? And so over a long enough time range, like these things somewhat are convergent in a known range, right? Maybe that known range is like for ETH, like I don't know, I'd say right now maybe like 500 would seem insane, and 5,000 would also seem insane. So that's like a massive window. But within that range, like I have a predictable loss, and how long will it take for my fees to exceed that loss? And that's the race. We have a really interesting, it's maybe more sophisticated than like sort of the broader audience, but we have a really interesting tool called the heat map in our market making tool, where we show people like time and like the divergent loss. We're like, hey, over enough time, if you get to here and there's no change in price, this is how much fees you'll earn. But if the price goes up 10% or goes down 20%, like this is where your payout will be. So it's a map of like red, bad, green, good heat map showing over time where you'll be, to kind of paint this picture of the race of like, here's the rate of your fees if we're earning this much, and here's the cost of divergence. And so like trying to give people a visualization for the risk reward that they're getting into.
Dude, I love it, dude. It sounds like a really useful tool. Where are you guys kind of at in terms of release, like beta, alpha, omega? I don't know.
Yeah, so we are wrapping up like sort of our third iteration of audits, and we're confident that this is the last one. So we will go into a period of fixing those findings, and we think we can wrap that up by in March. And so we'll actually be, once we're like 100% confident on that. I think I would say 60% confident on that today. I'm hoping to get to like 80% confident by the end of the week. But we'll be deploying our vaults actually first. And so our vaults are meant to be similar in the sense that some other products have had, maybe hyperliquid's too confusing, but you can just put your money in hyperliquid vaults, right? We will have the same kind of initial offering where you can just put in stable coins. You can just put in USDC, you can just put in ETH. We will take those assets and make them valuable to the protocol in a hedged way. So similar to I was talking about Squeeth, and like the hedge doesn't always work out, but we think this is a important, like, to get the ball rolling. And so we'll be incentivizing those vaults through a soon to be created token, right? like just using points probably out of the gate, that we'll have a points program that will eventually, turn into tokens, and that will get the ball going, right? And
Mhm.
so actually, one thing I'll maybe point out here is Uniswap V3 went to the concentrated route. Our vaults will actually go the other way, where we're not going to be market making with all those assets. We're going to only be market making with half of them, because we think it's actually something that is beneficial, but should be done in moderation, right? And this
Okay.
actually, then you're getting lending yield and you're getting swap fees, but in a less risky way,
Mhm.
because we're not market making with everything. And then on top of it, we're hedging the risk using out of the money options, and this makes the downside bounded. So I can say this is actually the downside that is possible within this very large price range. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from liquidity providers that we've talked to about this like sort of setup, and so that we want to be ready within a week or two to deploy. The initial assets will just go into like a gauntlet vault on Morpho, because we want pre-deposits. We want to have like sort of a starting gun, and have the protocol have assets immediately. But then once we launch, we'll start moving those funds from Gauntlet into the protocol, into a very specific strategy that's hedged, and yeah.
So we're talking about 1 to 2 weeks out, and these vaults, these are the ones that are gonna be taking USDC or
USDC or ETH.
yeah, because we want to give the people a real quick call to action here. What is the best way for them to get involved right now?
Get your
Join
ETH
them.
USDC ready. Follow us on socials. We'll have we definitely have a lot of announcements ready once we, that confidence level is in a higher percent than the sort of 60% I said now.
Mhm.
We just want to try to avoid a false start as much as possible. So definitely weeks, not months, right? That we are away
Mhm.
from firing the open gun. So follow us on socials, join Discord, and then keep an eye out for when we make the announcement that everything's ready to go.
The mental model in my mind a lot clearer to how to think about impermanent loss and how to think about market making. That bounded range, it's often way larger, way broader than maybe we're comfortable with. But thinking of it as like a race, like how long do I need to stay in this range to make it worth my while based off of like how far I diverge? That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Um, that's why LPing USDC and then and USDT is probably if you got enough size, the best possible one, right? Like how far could they possibly diverge? Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm getting off topic here, but I want to thank you, Will. This was a really great chat, man.
Come on. Yo, this that spooky shit. That real spooky That's right. Shit. That GM Sonic shit. Hey, yo, Mr. Clean. Shout out to Dracula Presley. Corvus.